let's start talking about the arguments against the resurrection. The first argument is that Jesus never died. This takes two forms. The first form is actually something that's very popular among Muslims. Jesus was never crucified. Most Muslims do not believe that Jesus was crucified at all. And that's because they regard him as a prophet. And crucifixion was so shameful and so painful, they said there's no way that God would allow this to happen to his prophet. So one of the arguments that Jesus never died is from this idea that he was never crucified. Now, where did they get this idea from? Besides their religious notions, there were these false writings, apocrypha. So many of the apocrypha is not a good word. I know many of you who know me well know that that's a pet peeve of mine. A lot of the Orthodox are very open to the apocrypha because they like them, but the apocrypha are false writings. That's why they were rejected by the church, and some of them are heretical, including the ones that say Jesus was never crucified. And they say that he was never crucified because they don't believe that these people called themselves Christians, but they didn't believe that Jesus was ever incarnate. He never had a human body, okay? So those stories were read and sort of circulated, kind of popular stories. They liked the miracles of Jesus, but they didn't like the idea of him being human. So who heard some of those stories? Well, Muhammad heard those stories because Muhammad was a trader. He traveled widely, and people would stop at night and they would sit around a fire and they would tell stories, and he heard those stories. And some of these stories ended up in the Quran. Okay? So among the stories is this idea that when the time came for Jesus to be crucified, because Simon of Cyrene was carrying the cross, Simon was crucified instead of Jesus. There's another story that I think is kind of popular, that Jesus, they came to arrest Jesus, and he came out of his, there was like a little house, so this is the way they tell the story. And somebody else looked exactly like Jesus. And so Jesus was never crucified, but this other person was crucified in his place. Okay, so that's the first argument, that Jesus never died. The part one is popular with Muslims, and that is that somebody else was crucified instead. So let's talk about this. Does it make sense that somebody else would be crucified, especially Simon of Cyrene, instead of Jesus? Now, just imagine this. Jesus is condemned to death by Pontius Pilate. They put the crossbeam on his back, and he starts to walk to Golgotha, so to the place of crucifixion. And he had been scourged, so he's covered from head to toe in wounds, and he's bloody and battered, and he'd been beaten up by the guards and by the Jews after the trial and all this. And then he can't carry the cross. So they get this guy who's just a bystander, Simon of Cyrene, and they compel him to carry the cross. So Simon carries the cross. Do you think that the guards forgot who their prisoner was? Does it make sense that they would have crucified Simon instead? Simon was perfectly healthy. He wasn't bloody and battered. How could they possibly mistake who the person who was supposed to be crucified? It's absolutely nonsensical. Now, one of the reasons why the Muslims don't believe that Jesus was crucified is because they don't believe in the humility of Christ. They don't believe in the self-sacrifice of Christ. They don't believe in the mercy of Christ or the love of Christ or the forgiveness of Christ. They regard Jesus as a prophet, but they don't think of Jesus the way we do. As a matter of fact, they think we're all fools to believe in the humility, the love, the mercy of Christ. So even though people say, well, the Muslims, they respect Jesus, not the way we do. They don't have anything like our conception of Jesus Christ. So there's no way that Simon of Cyrene was crucified by mistake. A perfectly healthy man who was just sort of pressed into service to carry the cross versus somebody else who was walking behind him or alongside of him, who was bloody and battered, who had been scourged, and everybody knew was the person who was intended to be crucified. See what I'm trying to say? It's just so nonsensical.